Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tammy McCabe, and I'm the Manager of Communications and Industry Relations here at the NLCSA. This week, in partnership with Workplace NL and the OHS Division of Digital Government and Service NL, we're promoting Fall Prevention Awareness Week. As falls continue to be a leading cause of injury in the construction industry, together we've launched an initiative aimed at raising awareness, educating, and providing employers with strategies and tools that they can use to prevent falls in their respective workplaces. Throughout the week, in partnership with Workplace NL, we'll be hosting a series of webinars focused again on raising awareness and fall prevention. Visit our Fall Prevention Awareness Week website for a full listing of webinars. I'll chat a little more about the Fall Prevention Awareness website at the end of today's session. One of the key elements of any effective health and safety management system is hazard recognition, evaluation, and control. And this morning, we're going to talk about the importance of assessing hazards in the workplace and look at some common fall hazards. Krista Cleary is one of the health and safety advisors here at the NLCSA, and it's my pleasure to introduce Krista. Krista will take us through the first half of the presentation. So over to you, Krista.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tammy. So like Tammy said, we are going to be talking about the hazard recognition, evaluation, and control. And we're going to focus mostly on fall hazards because obviously this is Fall Prevention Awareness Week. So we are going to be talking about various things throughout this seminar. So some of the things that we're going to focus on is what is a hazard, and so we'll give different examples and things like that throughout, not just specific to falls, but we will talk about some of them. We're going to talk about the different types of falls and how they can occur, and what kind of things can lead up to those. And then we're going to focus on hazard assessments, so what they are, and then we'll get into one of the processes of the basic process of how we can do an effective hazard assessment. Then we're going to be talking about different types of hazard assessments. So there are different types, but they all pretty much follow the same basic processes, but they all have different purposes and things like that. So Tammy is going to certainly discuss some of those. And then finally, we're going to talk about the benefits of hazard assessments. Why are we doing these, and why should workers be doing them? Why should supervisors be involved in completing them? And why should the employer be making sure that it's part of their program? So without further ado, we're going to first look at what is a hazard. So a hazard is any source, object, material, substance, condition, practice, behavior, anything else that has the potential to cause injury, illness, or property damage. So if you break this down into, what kinds of examples we can give for this. So like you think about objects. Okay, so how can an object be a hazard? Well, you think about if there's falling objects, right? So if you have a worker who's working beneath and we have falling objects, certainly that could cause injury to them. We have materials. So think about things like maybe asbestos or anything like that that you may be working with. Substances, different types of chemicals that we could be working with. So think about paints, anything really with a safety data sheet. And then we have conditions. So think about things like a slippery surface, right? Very, very common in our atmosphere, in our work areas. It could be due to weather outside, working out in rain or foggy weather, or anything like that. But it could also be based on poor housekeeping or what kind of work we're actually doing. It could be a poor design workspace, right? So having workers work in an area, there's an example there of awkward positioning. So someone sitting at a computer, that's not ergonomically efficient for them. However, it could be tons of other things. You look at, like I said, slippery surfaces, and there's just a ton of other ones. Practices, so think about like a removing of guards, people not following the proper procedures or the proper way to operate a piece of equipment, or all those safe work practices that are outlined in the company safety program. And then last but not least, we have behavior. So think about things, there's an example there of fatigue. So people being tired, think about rotational work or people working long hours and kind of stuff that does to them. We could also be bullying. So harassment on the work site, workplace violence. We could also have complacency or people, just not wanting to follow the rules or, things are outlined. Maybe we might have ineffective supervision or where maybe the supervisor is not aware of what their roles and responsibilities are. So all these things can contribute to hazards. So then we're going to look at the different types of falls. So some examples that we have, they're fall to the floor, okay? Walkway or other surface, fall onto or against other objects, or wet slippery surfaces. So in that picture there, you see that there is a worker who's working and, there's cords and things like that he could easily trip on. So things that would be, him tripping over that cord. He's not falling from a height, it's at the same surface and he's just falling, tripping over that. Then we also have another picture of rebar. So you can see how it has the caps on it, but you can imagine if a worker is working and they trip or anything, then they become caught on that and can impale themselves and seriously hurt themselves. These hazards that are associated with any construction work, they increase the potential for being hurt. And this can lead to from poor work practices. So maybe there's no job procedures or work practices put in place. Maybe workers aren't aware of what they are or how to do it properly. Maybe they just aren't effective. So there's been changes in maybe the legislation or a safer way to do it, and those changes have not been implemented into their safety program. Maybe they're rushing to complete the job, so trying to get it done as quickly as possible, but and not taking the time and to really make sure that they are working in a safe manner to prevent any types of falls. Poor lighting, right? So if workers can't see where they're working, that can cause trips and anything like that. Poor housekeeping, extension tools, or extension cords, air hoses, tools, garbage, construction waste materials, things like that on the job site that can certainly pose for workers to trip or any types of falls from on the same level. So then we have falls to the lower level. So this could be something from like a ladder, falling off a ladder. So that's the first picture there. We have a worker who's working on top of a ladder. It could be from scaffolds, staging, platforms, a non-moving vehicle. And we often forget about that, but workers can definitely still fall from a vehicle. A floor, dock, or ground level, downstairs or steps, and you'll often see this in construction, especially where they are in the midst of building these things, and they may not have it fully finished, or it hasn't been completed or started yet, and there's a potential there for someone to fall downstairs, lose their footing, that kind of stuff. Falling off roof. So in the last picture there, we have a worker who is attaching to a anchor point. So making sure that we have things like that put in place. It can be from piled or stacked materials. So all of these things can cause falls to a lower level, and contributing factors that can increase the potential to falling to a lower level can be falling through an unguarded hole. So think about like a trench or something like that that doesn't have any type of protection or may not have any type of protection, and workers can certainly fall through. Falling out of a piece of equipment. Think about, an aerial work platform or any type of piece of equipment like that a worker could certainly, if they're not using it properly or they don't have the appropriate fall protection on, they can certainly fall out of that as well. Lack of guardrails. So in one of the pictures there, you can see that there is a guardrail system put up. So by not having adequate guardrails put up, and we need to make sure that they're followed our regulations outlined in to make sure that they are installed correctly. Inadequate coverings for open holes, so make sure that if we do have open holes that they are adequately covered, and they are warning workers that they are aware that there is an open hole behind this, and so that they can take the necessary precautions to make sure that they are that they don't fall through it. Inadequate coverings for skylights. So making sure that if we are working around skylights on a roof, that we have making sure that there is some type of covering over it or some type of protection so that we don't end up falling through those as well. Poor setup of scaffolds. So that's another common one. Scaffolding needs to be set up properly. Depending on the type of scaffold, there are certain criteria that need to be met, certified and all those things. So we need to make sure that they are putting it up and putting up correctly, and then also using it in a safe manner. Lack of rails on stairs, so making sure that people have handrails to hold on to as they are ascending or descending stairs. And then once again, we also have wet or slippery surfaces, so kind of all those situations can be enhanced if wet or slippery surfaces are in place there. So another type of fall that we have is jump to lower level. So we often think of falling, but sometimes people can get injured even though they're are actively jumping from one level to a lower level. So think about people who are operating heavy equipment or any piece of equipment that they can jump instead of using the stairs or the steps to descend safely to the ground. So think about people exiting a dump truck. It could be like a pan of a truck or something like that. So they're actively jumping from one location to another. So how can we identify hazards that we encounter? So it's important for us to understand, okay, so how can we effectively identify what kinds of hazards that we can be exposed to in our workplace? So this may mean that we are looking at different, taking a step back and looking at what kinds of hazards that we can be exposed to. And we need to document these things so that we can make sure that we need to document these things so that we can make sure that we are aware of what's going on and that we are effectively controlling these hazards. And the best way we can do that is to conduct a hazard assessment, get everyone involved, and write this information down so that we can make sure that it is adequate. So some information on a hazard assessment. So hazard assessments are a systematic approach to review the workplace to identify any potential or existing hazards. So that's the whole premise of a hazard assessment, is we're going to take a step back and look at what hazards can be presented to us in our workplace. By looking at the tools, the equipment, the situations, the processes, we can have a better idea of what potential and existing hazards we can be exposed to while working. So by looking at these different situations, the tools, the equipment, having the information or having training on these things, we can look at, okay, if we don't put anything in place, where can this go wrong? Where can we see potential injuries, illnesses, and things like that? So hazard assessments must be completed prior to work commencing, as we can ensure the appropriate controls are implemented prior to starting work. So we need to make sure that this is done beforehand, before the job starts. And Tammy's going to go through the different types of hazard assessments, but we're going to make sure that we are looking at what types of hazard assessments that we need to consider, and at what point is each one practical. By planning what we need to eliminate or reduce the potential for a hazard situation. That's the whole goal of a hazard assessment, is to reduce the potential or to completely eliminate it as low as reasonably achievable. We're also going to conduct hazard assessments, or maybe reevaluate the hazard assessment that we've completed if there's any changes in the workplace, the activity, any additional hazards are presented. So as we're going through the activity that we're doing, things change. And work, especially in the construction industry, work is ongoing. It's constantly changing. Different subcontractors are coming in and out of the site potentially, and there's often delays, and so sometimes we need to step back as we're in the middle of the task and think about, okay, so from here, what kind of changes or what extra are we exposed to now? If there's any changes, we need to make sure, so this will allow us to reevaluate it at that point in time and implement any additional controls to make sure that we are working in a safe manner as much as possible, and that any controls that we can be identified or that have been identified or that we can foresee are effectively controlled. So the employer is also responsible for ensuring that the safety program includes a system for the recognition, evaluation, and control of the hazards. So that's actually in our legislation, section 12(1)(g) in the Newfoundland Labrador Occupational Health and Safety Regulations. So one of the ways an employer can accomplish this is by ensuring effective hazard assessments are being completed. So making sure that we have a procedure put in place, and making sure that workers are aware of how to complete a hazard assessment, what to look for, what certain aspects that we should be looking for, and how to effectively look at our activity, our workplaces, and things like that, and making sure that we are adequately assessing our situations, our workplaces. A hazard assessment is just one format in which hazards can be identified. So, hazards, we're focusing on hazard assessments, but, hazards can also be identified on inspections, unfortunately, after an investigation occurs, or fortunately, after an investigation occurs, through the committee, there's various formats. So this is just one aspect that we are going to look at. It's very important, but it is just one aspect. Hazard assessments, they need to have an involvement. So this would be with workers, supervisors, any other workplace party. And the reason why we're involving all of these workplace parties is so that we can get a comprehensive assessment of any potential or existing hazards that we could be exposed to. So by including all of these workplace parties, we're now allowing for different perspectives, experiences, knowledge of each person to contribute. So we will get a more effective tool. We're making sure that everyone is adding value to that hazard assessment. If one person just completes it, they could easily miss something, or maybe not effectively control it as well as it could be. And I mean, who knows the job better than the workers who are doing the work? So they should have a lot of experience of effectively identifying what potentially could go wrong, or what kind of controls need to be put in place. So this is our basic hazard assessment process. So it includes 5 steps. And by having a process outlined in our safety program, it allows for workers, supervisors, and other various workplace parties to develop an effective hazard assessment to prevent injuries, illnesses, or fatalities. So there are 5 main steps to this. We have the first one being identify the hazards. So this would be including the job hazards and the site hazards. So we're going to identify work areas, activities, related activities, those sorts of things. Then we're going to, step 2 is to assess the risk. So we're going to assess the hazards, be sure to consider people, the equipment, the materials, and the environment. And then we're going to talk about a hazard risk ranking system. And then step 3 is to develop the controls. So once we've identified what our hazards are and how serious the likely outcome could be, the risk, then we're going to identify, develop hazard controls. So we're going to look at what are the most effective controls down to the least effective controls. All play a critical part in our control system. And then we have step 4, which is implement and communicate. So how can we make sure that this is implemented, and making sure that workers are aware of what their expectations are, and making sure that all of this information is communicated to all the necessary workplace parties to make sure that they know how to effectively work and implement these control measures to prevent any accidents or incidents from occurring. And then last but not least, we're going to monitor and reevaluate. So we're going to take a look at, what, not just once we implement these things, we want to make sure that they're still working, they're still effective. And if they aren't, then what changes can we make to our system? What kind of improvements can we make so that workers are still being safe and they're not going to be hurt, and at the end of the day they're going to go home in the same condition that they came to work in. And so that is a continuous cycle. So once, if anytime we need to reevaluate it, then we would start back to, okay, so what are some of the hazards now? And we're going to constantly do this. You take any piece of this process away, and you're not going to have an effective hazard assessment. So the first step is to look at the identification of the hazards. So we're going to look at people, the equipment, the materials, and the environment. So when we think of people, so people are not just limited to workers. That's often the first thing that we do look at. And while that is important, there are other people that we need to think about as well. So it can be workers, maybe it's supervisors, right? So think about workers who, not following the training protocols, just not working in a safe manner, not putting on their fall protection equipment, not putting up guardrails, that kind of stuff. And then we have supervisors, and that may come from a supervisor who is unaware of what their roles and responsibilities are as a supervisor. They don't know how to effectively have conversations or communicate what is expected to the workers. It could be different contractors coming on the job site. So, different, contractors may have a different schedule than what you're working on, and having that communication with everyone to making sure that they're all effectively working together to make sure that what one contractor is doing is not affecting what another contractor is doing as well. So then we have customers, could be visitors, so people who are not employed by you or the general public. So they're not employed by the company. However, they potentially could be coming onto your job site. So we need to make sure how they could contribute to different types of hazards on our workplace. Engineers and design, so how things are, our specs, how they are created, and what kind of, considerations do we have to give to that. Individuals involved in the maintenance. So you think about, people who are responsible for that, and what kind of contributions can they make to that. So making sure that they are, there is a preventive maintenance program. Things are being looked at and fixed in a quick manner. And even human resource personnel. So how can they contribute to hazards? Well, they're the ones who are responsible for hiring these people to do the work. So thinking about, who they are hiring, what qualifications do they have, what experience do they have, and things like that. And then we have equipment. So it's often a source of potential hazard. So think about like the tools, the machinery, the vehicles, the materials handling devices, personal protective equipment, aerial work platforms, ladders, scaffolding, things like that that people can work on. So what kind of, and that's going to vary depending on the type of equipment or tools that you are working from. So they all have different hazards. So, we can look at, um, manufacturer's instructions and things like that for all this pieces of equipment to determine what kind of hazards can we be exposed to by using this this equipment. So then we have materials. So this is used in the workplace and can be a contributing factor that includes raw materials. So think about like wood, steel, plastic, glass, chemicals, um, and any materials left on the ground. So while all these things might be controlled, but even just having them on the ground could contribute to tripping hazards. Think about like rebar, conduits, maybe there's poor storage. We often see that, it could be timing management. So, there's all these projects ongoing for this one company, and they have all this equipment or all this product in one area, and trying to get it to the different sites and things like that. Poor placement. So think about, especially with falls, we look at, placing things towards the edge of the roof as opposed to in the middle of the roof on a flat roof. Making sure that people aren't tripping it or, putting themselves at extra risk because they are going towards the edge of the roof or something like that. And then we have environment. So the environment encompasses both the physical and the non-physical aspects of the workplace. So we often just think of, the weather and how that can contribute to our to the hazards on the job site. And easy, enough to think about, how rain affects, if you're working outside on a roof, by working in rain, now you're increasing the potential for having slippery conditions. Wind, we often see in Newfoundland. So by working on a building, the potential for wind holding like a piece of plywood or something like that, and now you've increased the potential that you could fall. There could also be uneven ground, right? So walking, right, causing rolled ankles and tripping hazards and things like that. But also think about like setting up scaffolding or ladders. So if you're setting up a piece scaffolding or ladders, you're required to set up on, even ground or a flat surface. But that's often hard to do in a construction site. So, if they're not set up, then there's a potential that someone could fall and certainly hurt themselves. So then we also look at the non-physical environments. So think about the leadership style. Get this done now, as opposed to, all right, let's take our time to do it so we can do it safely. It's just a quick job, right? So not taking all the protocols and, doing our hazard assessments and considering what could happen if we don't put all the controls in place prior to working at heights or any type of work. Business organization and community culture. Okay, so what kind of expectations do we have? Marketplace factor, right? So knowing, what kind of if I don't do this job, or if I don't do this the way that the supervisor says, is there more jobs out there that, if I refuse this job or if I, decide to leave this company, and that can often put people in a predicament to make sure that they are working in a safe manner, and that we don't want to make sure, or we want to make sure that they are going to work in a safe manner. So we certainly don't want to put them in a situation where they feel the obligation to work in an unsafe manner. So in the event that, well, if I quit here, then do I have another job to go to? Regulatory or legislative issues. So looking at, what the requirement is legislatively. and any organizational management systems, which include policies, procedures, and work practices. So think about, do we have up-to-date policies and procedures that are reflective of the current legislation, or even any standards industry standards that could be applicable to the type of work that we're doing. You think about like the CSA standards, they are evolving. And so if there's any updates or anything like that, are we abiding by that? So, what are some ways to recognize potential hazards in the workplace? Well, we can do this by doing hazard assessments and looking at previous hazard assessments that have been completed for similar jobs. We can do inspections. So this can be workplace inspections, walkthroughs of our job sites. This can also be inspections of equipment and tools and things like that prior to using them. And we can also look at investigations. So what kind of, maybe it's near misses that we've had, maybe they're incidents that we have had, and what can we learn from those so that we can prevent that from happening again. So, like I said earlier, doing hazard assessments is a systematic approach. So it's looking at, okay, so what kind of processes and stuff can we look at prior to working? Then we have records and documentation. So what kind of paperwork and that kind of stuff that we can look at? Well, we can look at previous hazard assessments, previous workplace inspections, what kind of issues have arisen from that, incident investigations, like I said, safety data sheets. So what information does a safety data sheets have? That's going to identify, what are potential hazards that are associated with that type of chemical, but then also what kind of controls, effective controls can we put in place? Looking at maintenance records. So what is the history of this piece of equipment? Has there been any maintenance on it recently? Or what kind of things have been identified and have they been fixed? Looking at workplace NL documents, so looking at different statistics and information that they may have. The manufacturer's operating manuals, so that's going to outline the exact process of or procedure on how to do it. Some safe work practices, maybe the do's and don'ts on how to operate that piece of equipment, but then also what kind of controls can we put in place? What kind of PPE do we need? What kind of training do we need? We can also look at surveys and input from employers, supervisors, contractors, so making sure that we are getting that involvement from the workers or different workplace parties, making sure that their voices are heard, and that if there's any anything that they have identified, we are taking that into consideration. And then we can also look at professional assistance. So this could be subject matter experts. So think about someone like a hygienist, hazard materials assessments, emergency response personnel. We have in our province, we have service NL, and we also have workplace NL. So the next step is to assess the risk. So once we have identified all of our hazards, we need to evaluate them for risk. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what is risk. Well, risk is the chance or the probability that a person will be harmed or experience an adverse health effect if exposed to a hazard. It also may apply to situations with property or equipment loss. So we take a look at, what could happen if there are no controls implemented at this point. So two factors that we consider are the severity. So how serious would the consequence be? And then we look at the probability. How likely would it happen? So the severity can range from a minor injury, think about like, a small cut, to someone who is killed on a job site. So very differences in the severity, and it ranges between those two extremes. And then we have the probability. Well, yes, there are some situations where someone could die, but the chances of it happening are very low or potentially very high. And so when we add those two things together, we look at the severity and the probability. That's how we get the risk. So I'm going to play a WorkSafe BC video. It's only approximately 2 minutes long, but it's going to help us understand what the difference between hazards and risk. A lot of times people don't understand the differences between the two, and in order to make your hazard assessment as effective as possible, we need to understand that there is a difference between the two, and we need to make sure that we are taking those things into consideration. So, uh,
If we were to cross the road here, the hazard is being hit by a moving vehicle. Part of doing a hazard identification is looking at the potential consequence. In this case, it could be a serious injury or even a fatality.
But we're on a country road. I mean, the chances of being hit look pretty slim.
Right. That's part of the risk assessment. Because the traffic flow is very minimal, the risk is low.
Whoa. But if we were trying to cross the road here, the hazard is much worse.
Nope.
Nope.
Nope. The hazard is the same, and so is the potential consequence of a fatality. It's the risk that's changed. It's now higher because the traffic flow is much heavier.
Okay. The hazard is the thing or condition that can hurt us. In this case, the vehicles. And the risk is the likelihood that the hazard will cause injury or disease. So, what does that have to do with the regulation?
Hazards arise out of the work environment and work tasks. And until you know what the hazards are, you can't determine the risks. In the workplace, you have to identify all the potential hazards and then assess the risk they pose. For example, if you were pulling a heavy box off a high shelf, what are the hazards?
Well, if the box was stacked poorly, it could fall on you.
Or you might strain your back lifting the box. Or if you tried to climb up, you might fall.
Wow, I didn't realize moving one box could involve so many hazards.
Right, there are often many hazards associated with a single task, and we need to assess the risk for each of them.
all right. So you can see in that video, they have kind of distinguished between what the difference between a hazard and a risk are. And while they are related, they are two different things. But it is important to understand, what the hazard is. A hazard is something that's going to cause that injury, that illness, whereas a risk is we're looking at what are the chances that this is going to occur. So on this screen, we just have a sample matrix that can be utilized, and there are many different scales for assessing risk, some different complexities, and this is just one example of how to assess the risk. But you can see on the top here, it looks at the severity. So we look at minor, first aid only, no lost time, moderate would be a moderate injury or illness, major, serious bodily injury, or 4 would be extreme, which would be death, permanent disablement. So we look at those things and we go, okay, so if no controls were implemented, what kind of severity would occur? Then we look at the probability. So the probability would be unlikely, could have happened, but rare, likely, it could happen, or very likely, it could happen frequently. So by looking at these things, by looking at this, what the severity is and what the probability is, you can see here that depending on what factors we choose, we can identify a low risk, a moderate risk, a high risk, or severe risk. So I just want to walk you through an example. So we're working on a roof. Falling off the roof is the hazard. That is what's going to cause the injury to us if there are no controls put in place. So the severity, we can either say is probably a major or extreme. Okay, so if depending on how high the roof is, you know, it could likely be one of those. However, the probability may change depending on the slope of the roof. So for example, if you're on a flat roof and you're working in the middle of the roof, the chances of you falling is very low. However, if you are working on a steep slope roof, and you're still in the middle of the roof, now you've just increase your chances that you are going to, you increase that probability that you would fall. So now we have the same situation in the middle of a roof, but now we have changed the situation depending on the slope of the roof. So now, while if you fell off the roof, the severity is going to stay the same. However, we have just changed the probability. So the more severe the risk, the employer needs to have a greater focus on the higher level of controls to ensure that the hazard is reduced as low as reasonably achievable. So for higher risk activities, so those that we deem, you know, severe risk, a high risk, those types of things, we're going to make sure that there's supervisory oversight and confirmation that controls have been implemented and authorized to begin the work. So by assessing the risk, we can now make sure that those hazards that are going to cause the most injury, or could potentially kill us or cause serious illnesses, we're going to make sure that those we're going to focus on those controls. While you know, the ones that cause minor injuries or are low risk, we're still going to have controls put in place, but we're going to make sure that we focus mostly on those severe, the high risk, and even the moderate risk. All right, and now I'm going to hand it over to Tammy.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so as Krista said, you know, we want to identify the hazards, and then once we've identified them, then we're going to look at the risk associated with each of those hazards. And once we've assessed the risk, then we want to make sure that we develop effective control measures to eliminate or mitigate the risk. So first of all, what's a control measure? So basically, a control measure is an effective way to eliminate or reduce the impact of a hazard. The control measures could depending on the exposure to the hazard. So a control measure for falling off a roof may not be the same control measure for falling off a ladder. So the control measures are really going to be dependent on the hazard and the risk and the particular situation that we're dealing with. So any control measures that we implement, we have to ensure that they meet legislative requirements as well. So the OHS regulations are going to outline the minimum requirements. So we're trying to determine how to effectively control a hazard. One of the first places we want to start looking is at the occupational health and safety legislation for the particular jurisdiction that you're working in. So if you go to our particular occupational health and safety regulations, it's broken down into parts, and we can look at some of the different type of work activities or different hazards that someone might be exposed to, and the regulations will outline the minimum requirements for controlling those hazards. So for example, Part 5 of the OHS regulations talk about the general health and safety requirements, but also include provisions for roof work, opening pits and tanks. If we look at Part 10 talks about fall protection. So when people are required to work at height. Part 11 deals with working on scaffolds, stages, and work platforms. Powered mobile equipment will be Part 12, work and around excavations, Part 18, and diving and marine operations. And then there's also parts for working over water. So if you're going to be implementing a control measure, it's important that you consult with the occupational health and safety regulations to make sure you're familiar with what the legislative requirements are for that particular activity or those particular hazards. Then you want to take a look at any company or site policies and procedures that have already been established. Quite often companies will develop their own policies and procedures that direct work and work activities and outline what control measures need to be in place before you undertake a particular activity. So it's important that you consult those when you're thinking about implementing control measures. You might also look at a manufacturer's instructions. So if you look at the manufacturer's instructions or the operating instructions for an aerial work platform, for example, those will outline any requirements that are required to be followed, operating conditions, training requirements, specialized equipment that might need to be used when operating the equipment. So that'll help give you some direction. Similarly to if you're working from a ladder, you know, looking at the manufacturer specifications for the specific ladder that you're using. So what are the weight restrictions? So those will help you develop procedures as well, which are also control measures for utilizing that particular piece of equipment. There may be times when you have to consult with professionals. Perhaps you have a very unique fall hazard, and you know, controlling it might be something that you're challenged with, or you may not necessarily be able to comply specifically with the occupational health and safety regulations that are in place in the province. So that's when you want to consult with the OHS division of Digital Government and Service NL to consult with them. You may need to consult with Workplace NL. They may be able to provide you with some guidance. And on occasion, you may have to consult with some subject matter experts. Perhaps you need to consult with a group that develops fall protection systems, maybe an engineering company that develops specific fall arrest systems for a particular situation. It could be a rescue situation that you're dealing with that you're not quite sure how you know, you're going to be able to manage or control that effectively. And then you might want to consult with rescue specialists. So consulting with professionals is another way of helping you identify how can we effectively control this. Additionally, you know, you may want to consult with SDS sheets if you're dealing with chemicals. And I guess an example of this I can think of, if you're using particular soft goods for your fall arrest system and you're also working with a particular chemical, ensuring that the chemical that you're using can't cause any damage or defect to the soft goods like your harness or your lanyards that you're using for your fall arrest system. So there's lots of different tools out there to help you determine exactly what level of control or what type of control measures are required. And, you know, again, even consulting with your industry association. So like if you're in the construction industry, you know, give us a call, the NLCSA, I'm sure I'm working, give us a call at the NLCSA, and, you know, we'd be happy to give you some guidance. And if we can't give you specific guidance, then we'll happily direct you to those individuals that can. So developing hazard controls. When we're implementing hazard controls, one of the things that's really important is that we consider the hierarchy of controls. So if you look at it as a triangle here, you've got the little pyramid, and at the top it talks about elimination. So eliminating basically means removing the hazard. So if we remove the hazard, then the chances of a worker being injured as a result of exposure to the hazard is gone, because we've actually gotten rid of the hazard. So sometimes that's possible. For example, working at height, you know, perhaps instead of actually doing the work at height, we may be able to do some of the work on the ground and prevent workers from actually having to go and do the work at height. So sometimes that's possible. Substitution would mean, you know, swapping or replacing the hazard with something less hazardous, or could be changing out a work process. So for example, erecting a set of stairs along the side of a building as opposed to having ladder access, because the stairs might actually prove a little bit safer for workers climbing than trying to climb a ladder. Similarly, you know, painting a building. So rather than trying to do that from a ladder, then a scaffolding system might actually be a little bit safer for workers to use. Other engineering controls like isolation. So isolation basically means isolating people away from the hazard. So putting some kind of a barrier there between the worker and the actual hazard. So guardrail is a great example of an isolation or an engineering control. So it acts as a barrier between the worker and the open edge. Administrative controls. So administrative controls change the way people work, teach them how to work safely around the hazard. So, you know, in terms of fall protection, some of the administrative controls we would have in place, again, our hazard assessment is a great way of helping people learn about the right way to work, helps them learn about the hazard. We've got orientations to projects and project requirements, training, so ensuring that where necessary, workers are trained in fall protection. It could be safe work practices or specific job procedures that have been developed by an organization, ensuring that, you know, those are communicated and workers understand them and that they're being enforced as well. ensuring that our equipment is inspected. So harnesses, lanyards, lifelines, whatever systems we're using for fall protection, ensuring that perhaps there's a, not perhaps, but ensuring that there's a regular process for inspecting them. Completing fall protection plans and rescue plans. So, ensuring we've identified what the specific fall hazards are on the work site, and we've identified the necessary controls and communicated those to the necessary individuals. And then last but not least is personal protective equipment. So personal protective equipment basically is a piece of apparel or a device used or worn by the worker that basically provides a little bit of protection in the event that they're exposed to the hazard. It doesn't actually eliminate the hazard, and it doesn't say that they're not going to be able to be exposed to the hazard. All it does is help to try to reduce the severity of an injury should contact actually occur. So unfortunately, when we think about controlling hazards on a work site, quite often our minds jump to, well, what PPE do we need? And that's actually the last thing we should be considering. When we're addressing hazards, we want to take a look at the higher levels of controls first and foremost. So, personal protective equipment, as I said, doesn't guarantee that the worker is not going to be injured. For example, if a worker's using a fall arrest system and they fall using a fall arrest system, there's still a very good likelihood that they're going to be seriously injured in their fall arrest system. They won't hit the ground if the system's being used properly, and hopefully it will actually prevent them from being even more seriously injured or killed. But at the end of the day, there could still be injury to the worker. Whereas if someone was working at height and we were able to establish an effective guardrail system, then the worker would actually have a barrier there, and it would be something protecting them or preventing them from falling to the lower level. So when we're selecting our controls, it's very important that we take a look at starting at the top, starting with the higher level controls when we're controlling a hazard, but also that we look at risk. So as Krista spoke about, if we have a hazard that's a high risk, then we want to make sure that we have these higher level controls implemented. It's no good to have a worker exposed to a really high risk hazard and just say, oh, we'll just throw a little bit of PPE on them and they'll be safe. We want to make sure that there are things like supervision as well, that, the hazards are communicated, there's some process for actually authorizing the work by the supervisor and confirming that all the effective controls are in place. So, wherever possible, we want to start with a higher level of controls first and work our way to the lower level controls. And again, quite often personal protective equipment is used when there's a lower risk hazard, or again, just in the event that it's a backup, in the event that the other systems fail. So if it's a higher risk hazard, again, we might have some engineering control, we might have some administrative controls in place, but the personal protective is there, again, as a just in case. So there is a process to applying controls. Once we've actually determined what control measures we're going to implement, then we need to make sure that they are actually implemented. So having someone assigned to confirm that, these things have actually been in place, or that the procedures have been communicated to workers, the guardrails have been installed, whatever those controls are, making sure that someone's assigned to follow up and ensure that they've been implemented. And again, this can be a part of your hazard assessment process. At the end of it, ensuring that we've reviewed it with workers and that we've confirmed everything's in place before actually beginning work. We want to make sure that the control that we've implemented has actually effectively controlled the hazard so that it continues to protect people. So we put up a guardrail, not that the guardrail is incomplete, that it's complete, it provides full protection to the area that, workers could be exposed to a fall hazard. When we implement new hazard controls, we also need to ensure that we're not creating new hazards sometimes by implementing control measures. And I guess the best example I can think of for this one, I was working once upon a time in a location where we implemented anti-fatigue mats for a couple of reasons, and they were also anti-slip anti-fatigue mats. So they had holes in them for water and grease. And they were meant to help provide some anti-slip for the workers that worked in an area, but also anti-fatigue. And with ineffective planning, what happened was the mats actually were too large for the walkway, and so we had workers pulling carts down through a walkway who all of a sudden now the carts were getting snagged on the corners of the mats. So this then created a potential soft tissue injury or tipping hazard for the carts that were being brought through the little walkway there. So again, it's important when we implement control measures that we actually ensure that we haven't created any new hazards. And then ensuring that we communicate the controls and the hazards to the workers. So ensuring that they understand, what's the hazard that they could be exposed to, and what is the risk associated with the hazard, and how do they control it, and why are we implementing these control measures? Because when people understand why we do something, they're much more inclined to comply or follow suit and appreciate it. And then workers also have to understand, if there are any future incidents, to report them with the particular hazard that they're working at. Maybe someone takes down a section of guardrail, then you know what? It's important that everyone knows that this is a hazard and that this has to be reported immediately. So ensuring that any incidents are reported, or any future incidents with the similar hazard. Now, once we've implemented the controls, that's not quite the end of the journey. So we need to ensure, as for the cycle that Krista kind of spoken about, that we continue to monitor the controls and make sure that they're properly protecting the safety and health of workers. Having a system to ensure, like our workplace inspections is a great tool to ensure regular review of controls. We've implemented controls in a workplace based on a hazard assessment or some other sort of a risk assessment process. And now our workplace inspection allows us to go back on a regular basis and ensure that these controls are continually or continue to be effective. We want to make sure that we regularly review any hazard assessments that we've done, or we complete new hazard assessments to ensure that they continue to be applicable to the work activity, that nothing about the work process has changed, and we don't need to modify the controls that we've actually implemented. Another thing we want to make sure that we review regularly are the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations. Have there been any changes made that require a higher level of control? And not just Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations, but also industry standards. So sometimes industry standards actually advance beyond the occupational health and safety regulations in a particular jurisdiction. And if that's the common practice for industry, it's really important that you're familiar with that and that your controls continue to meet what we are actually doing in industry. And then continuous communication. Again, implementing a control at one point and just communicating the hazards to the workers once, that doesn't work. Continuous communication is required. Regularly reviewing working at height, regularly reviewing slip, trip, and fall hazards, regularly reviewing procedures for working on ladders, making sure everyone understands and that we regularly talk about them so that they're not in the back of mind, they're actually in the front of people's minds. And then if we've actually identified any new hazards, the process starts again. We go back, evaluate the hazards, the new hazards that we've identified, and implement our controls, and the process starts again. So as Krista mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different tools or a lot of different systematic processes for assessing hazards in the workplace. I've got a list of some of the common ones that we see with different organizations, and it's important to note that, not every company uses every single one of these tools, but it's just good to be familiar with the different types of tools that are out there. So a comprehensive hazard assessment, what we call it here at the NLCSA, but there are other organizations that might call it a risk registry. There's other names for it. And basically what that does is it looks at all of the different activities that a company undertakes and assesses the hazards associated with those activities, looks at the regulations and confirms that they've effectively planned for all of these hazards prior to beginning work. So they've taken a broad level, top of the trees look at all the work that they do, and we've got the controls planned for that. Another great reason to have a comprehensive hazard assessment is that it helps companies with their pre-job hazard assessments, which is what I'll speak about next. So a pre-job hazard assessment is done before an organization undertakes a particular project or a particular job. It might be a new scope of work that you're taking on, you've just been on, you've been awarded that particular contract. Well, now we're going to do a hazard assessment that's specific to that particular piece of work. And we're going to look at the work activities associated with what it is we have to do for that job, and also the work site or the particular area where the work is going to be done. So that's really important that we consider both of those things, the hazards associated with the work activity, but then also the hazards associated with the particular site or the area in which the work is going to be carried out. So if you've actually developed a comprehensive hazard assessment for your organization and the different work activities that you have, then that can be used as a tool to help you build your pre-job hazard assessments. And quite often, like I said, if you're building a house, the processes involved with building a house don't change that frequently. So once you've established, the hazards and the controls, you can take particular sections out if you're only doing a particular type of work. Maybe you're doing some finishing work as opposed to, building a house from start to finish. Pre-job hazard assessments we've spoke about, but job safety analysis or job hazard analysis, you might hear them JHAs or JSAs. These hazard assessments take one particular activity and they break it down into its basic steps or procedure, and they look at the hazards associated with each of those steps along the way. So it could be erecting scaffolding. So they look at, taking scaffolding from the warehouse, bringing it to the work site, setting it up. What are all of the different hazards associated with that particular task? And, we don't necessarily have JSAs for everything, but certainly for any high-risk activities that we're doing, we should certainly consider developing a job safety analysis, perhaps for jobs where we've had incidents where workers have been injured, or maybe work that is new or jobs that we don't undertake very often. So, you can start building your inventory of job safety analysis. And then we've got a field level risk assessment. Field level risk assessments are usually done during the day by a worker or a work crew, and they, get assigned a particular task for that particular day. They go to a particular area to do the job, and before they begin, they actually stop, look at the job they're going to do that morning or that day, and break down the hazards that they might be exposed to, what controls do they need to have in place, and everyone confirms that everyone understands the work, the hazards are implemented, and then they begin. And then, I guess we could drill down even more narrowly into a personal assessment. Sometimes you'll hear of these little worker-based assessments, a Take 5 or whatnot, that basically asks a worker to step back before they put their hands on something and say, okay, do I know what it is I'm doing? Do I have the tools I need to do the job? Do I understand the risks associated with the job? Is everything in place before I actually begin? So as I said, there's a lot of different types of hazard assessment processes out there. Not every company is going to use all of them, but what's really important is that organizations have a system for assessing hazards. And, we start companies certainly when they are involved with the core program, we start them doing pre-job hazard assessments, and we ask that they start to develop their comprehensive hazard assessment as well. So, again, it's a tool that you have, and quite often you don't have to start, you don't have to recreate the wheel. Once you've done one, you can use that to help you build the next one. So I'm just going to show you a little sample of a comprehensive hazard assessment that is on our website. Just give me a moment and I'll pull up that screen. Okay, so what you can see there now is a sample comprehensive hazard assessment. This is for a little company called Buckets Painting and Plastering. You can see that they've actually taken the job activity. So this one's painting. So what are some of the related tasks with painting? Well, there's scaffold erection, there's ladder use, application of paint. And basically what they've done is they look at the hazards associated with each of those particular tasks, what risk is involved, what level of risk has been identified, and then what controls do they want to ensure or are necessary when carrying out that type of work. So, that's a sample comprehensive hazard assessment. And once you build your comprehensive hazard assessment, again, for your organization, as I said, when you're building your pre-job hazard assessments, then it becomes really easy to be able to go back to this document to help you. But then your pre-job hazard assessment also would look at the particular hazards associated with the area that you're going to be performing work in. Bear with me. Okay, so we've looked at the different types of hazard assessments. And now let's talk about the benefits. So why do a hazard assessment? Well, I think I'll speak to what I've already said several times, is that it is an occupational health and safety requirement. So under the Occupational Health and Safety Act and regulations, it doesn't matter how large your organization is, you are required to identify hazards in your workplace and ensure that your workers understand the hazards, that the hazards are controlled. Okay, so it doesn't matter what size your organization is, that is a legal requirement that you have to do, that you have to have a process. You know, you have to identify hazards and ensure that they're communicated to workers. So that is a requirement of employers, and it's a requirement of supervisors. Another benefit of doing a hazard assessment is that it increases awareness. So when you are, you know, taking your jobs, you're breaking them down, you're communicating these things to workers, you're raising everyone's level of awareness about health and safety, okay? If you've identified your hazards and effectively controlled them, well, then it goes to say that you're going to have fewer injuries and illnesses at your workplace. And then obviously that would result in lower costs associated with incidents. So you won't be incurring the same level of costs, whether they be direct costs because you've had an incident, or if it could be increased assessment rates through workplace NL. You know, you don't get your prime refund because you had increased incidents. So it can reduce costs. It can certainly increase productivity when everyone understands how to do a job the right way and safely. You're not going to have slowdowns in work. You're not going to have, you know, all of a sudden we got to stop work because something's gone wrong. We've got to now do an investigation. You know, it's going to actually keep things sped along. So having an effective health and safety management system can actually help increase productivity at your workplace. It can improve morale. So by getting workers and people outside the safety department involved in hazard assessments as well and thinking about safety, it increases their participation and helps build a positive safety culture. You know, when the company that you're working for is showing that it cares about you and protecting you and wants to ensure that you go home at the end of the day, that's going to make you feel good about that organization and certainly have more loyalty to the organization as well. As I said, it meets the legislative requirements, and it also reinforces the company's commitment to providing a healthy and safe working conditions. So again, you know, you want to be that company. It's becoming more of the norm now to have companies that have effective safety management systems than the other way around. So, you know, that's who you want to be as an organization. It's great to have effective health and safety management systems as it is to have effective human resource systems, operating systems, you know, that's it. So being you know, a well-organized company who's complying with occupational health and safety regulations and showing that you are committed to health and safety and to your workers. And that then also increases your competitiveness as an organization as well, because if you are bidding on work, larger organizations, general contractors don't want to hire companies that they have to worry about complying with legislation or they're going to cause greater challenges on their work site. They want to hire companies with good safety records. So in summary, hazard assessments are a key tool in the development and success of a safety program. It's a key part of your health and safety program. It helps you identify, you know, the training you need, what work procedures do you need to have in place, what emergencies do we need to plan for, you know, how do we develop our workplace inspections. So hazards, identifying hazards and hazard assessments are a critical part of any safety management system. They can certainly help prevent injuries and fatalities in the workplace. And they should be, and you should have a systematic approach to ensure that hazards don't get overlooked. So whatever that process looks like, you know, ensure that it's documented, ensure that you have a system or a policy or a procedure that says this is how we do things and that you follow that. So that's our session on hazard assessments. What I will say is that we have developed a Fall Prevention Awareness Week website. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the week, we started this initiative with Workplace NL and the OHS Division of Digital Government and Service NL, and they've been great partners. So we're trying to promote, raise awareness about fall hazards. If you want to visit our Fall Prevention Awareness Week website, you can go to the NLCSA's webpage, www.nlcsa.com, and there's a banner right across the top of our page. You can click there and it will take you to the rest of the webinars We're going to be uploading live toolbox talks. So if you want to have something that you can share with your workers about, slips, trips, and falls, donning a harness, scaffolding safety, we will actually have some live toolbox talks, 10, 15 minutes long if you want to review those. There's sample policies and procedures there for, your health and safety programs. There's fall prevention plan, inspection checklists for your harnesses and equipment, and there's some great statistics about falls in the construction industry. So if you give me a moment, I'll just share the page with you. All right, so this is our Fall Prevention Awareness Week website. And again, you can take a look, learn more. There's information about your fall hazards. If you visit the fall hazard page, you can see a list of toolbox talks and then some of our virtual toolbox talks down below that are going to be uploaded today. So you'll be able to access those. I'd also encourage you to take a look here at the middle of this page, construction industry fall statistics. It's quite interesting. We think about falls in the construction industry and we think about falling from height, but the reality is the majority of falls that we're having are not necessarily, falling off roofs. If you take a look, the top 8 fall hazards that we're having or types of falls, the number 1 is falls to floor, walkway, and surface. Falls from ladders coming in at number 2, and falls onto or against objects, number 3, falls from scaffolding, staging, and work platforms, number 4. So, there's some great information there that you can share with your workforce. That also might get you looking at the type of work activities you have and say, have we actually focused enough on some of these hazards that, we think about falls, we think, falling from a roof, that's what we're thinking about. But have we actually spent enough time controlling, assessing, and talking about some of these falls from lower levels? So, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope that you learned something new today. And this presentation will be recorded or is being recorded and will be uploaded to our fall prevention website as well. So, if you've got a group of workers, you want to sit down and, have them review the webinar, then, it's a great way of raising awareness. But as I said, that's the purpose of this initiative, was to raise awareness, to let everyone know that, falls are still occurring and not necessarily just the type of falls that we think about. So let's all kind of give some good focus. The construction season is, soon to start really gearing up for the year. And we want to make sure that these are controlled. We've got new hazards and, COVID-19, everyone's managing, trying to control COVID-19 on the website or on their work sites. But what we have to make sure is that, we don't forget about a lot of these other hazards that we have as well, and that we have a safe construction season. And that's it from me. So thanks, folks. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop us an email. We'd be happy to hear from you.